Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to talk about how American culture is changing during the 1920s. And we begin by exploring ways in which American culture is further tied together during this period. This is something that we saw at the end of the last video. Transportation is bringing American culture closer together. And we see this as in that Americans are having similar shared experiences. And we see this especially with entertainment culture that starts to emerge in the 1920s. First of all, with spectator sports like baseball, football, and boxing. These were events that spectators could now travel to in much larger groups thanks to the rise of the automobile, and therefore were more common shared experiences that were found all around the country. Something similar is going on with the development of the movie industry. First movie shown in New York City in 1896, and then the first talking movie shown in 1927. And going to the movies becomes the leading form of entertainment for Americans during this period. Americans spent 10 times on movies what they spent on sports, spectator sports. And over 80 million people are buying movie tickets each week. So that's a huge segment of the population. And the movies start to influence the consumer culture. So at the same time as you have the growth of mass production, you have greater access to this entertainment culture, which at the same time is promoting certain things in a more uniform way to a greater number of people than ever before. More people than ever before are seeing their same hairstyles, the same clothing styles, the same accents even on the television screen, on the movie screen, and that's spreading to the rest of the culture. We kind of take this for granted now, but this is the first time that we start to see that happen in the 1920s. And so advertising and movies are a way of promoting consumerism and promoting specific brands that come to dominate, specific brands and specific chains like Kellogg's, Walgreens, General Electric. A lot of those get their start on the way to becoming dominant national chains during this period as a result of the fact that they can transmit the same message to millions of Americans around the nation. We see the same thing happen with radio, where by 1930, about 2/3 of American families have radios, and the radios are changing the life of each family, where now the family is gathering around the radio in the evening. They're doing something together, but what they're doing or what they're engaging with is now coming from outside the home. And it's the same message that's coming out from outside the home that's going into all the other different homes and households in the country. And so you start to see President Coolidge is the first president to address the whole nation by radio. Radio made it possible for him to do this. And so it's in this way that a more uniform mass culture starts to be disseminated to the American people. And one of the best early examples of this is jazz music, a new style of music that develops during the 1920s that combined the energy of ragtime with the emotion of blues and gave rise to dance halls in the major cities where people would go and dance to this music, and also where people would listen to this music on the radio. Now, the word jazz comes from an African American slang for sexual intercourse, and Scott Fitzgerald coined this term, the Jazz Age, to talk about the 1920s. It was an era of increasing wealth for Americans, and as we've seen in the previous lecture video in this week, it's an era where freedom is emphasized. And we see this in the Jazz Age, where we see one of, if not the first, sexual revolutions, where attitudes towards sexual relationships are becoming much more liberalized and are changing very rapidly. And so now it's seen as cutting edge to be living a more liberalized life in terms of how you live your sexuality. And so we have the famous flapper ladies from the 1920s who presented themselves as unconstrained by previous standards of behavior. And they would smoke and they would drink, they would carry out these social behaviors that had previously been associated with men. And at the same time, we see two very powerful influences that are driving this sexual revolution further. The emergence of Sigmund Freud and his theory of psychoanalysis, which becomes very popular in the United States, and which argues that all human actions are in some way driven by sexual desire, or almost all actions are in some way driven by sexual desire. Even if it's a sexual desire that we are not conscious of, it's in there somewhere, and that's the role of psychoanalysis, to unpack that, and to unpack and to reveal that desire. But the understanding is that someone's sexual attractions are what define them. That's what's new, that's what's radical and different, is placing these kinds of attractions at the center of society and culture. The other major influence is the promotion of birth control by Margaret Sanger, beginning around 1911 and becoming promoted more aggressively as we get into the 1920s. For Margaret Sanger, this was a way, taking this pill was a way for women to be more in control of their bodies, to be liberated. Again, there's this language of freedom, which is very radical at the time, but which is saying, essentially, Freud and Sanger would agree with this, is saying that men and women have the same types of sexual energy and sexual attraction, and therefore that they should live the same way, and that a pill like the birth control pill is necessary in order to live in this way, to live in this revolutionary way in the 1920s.